Good evening and welcome to the very first Spotlight Lecture Series. We created this series to give friends of St. Ambrose Academy a window into the classroom, particularly during a time when we unfortunately cannot welcome you to visit in person. We have a diverse array of talks coming up, and I hope you'll check out ambroseacademy.org/spotlight for all the details. Before we get started tonight, I want to thank the Children's Dental Center of Madison, our 2020-2021 Spotlight Lecture Series sponsor. Their generous support has helped us put together a stellar lineup for you, and we are grateful for their commitment to classical education and yours here at St. Ambrose. Please remember that there's going to be some time at the end of the lecture for those of you who want to stick around and ask me questions. So please type in those comments at any point and we'll come back to them at the end. So without any further ado, let's begin with tonight's presentation, How to Discern Historical Truth. And as this is a window into the classroom, we'll start our class or our lecture, as we always do at St. Ambrose, with a prayer. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, you are the light of our existence and the source of all history. Guide us to see our brothers and sisters of the past with clarity and honesty, with humility and charity, so that we will better know your Son, Jesus Christ, who has fulfilled history through his cross and resurrection, and who is the same yesterday and today and forever. We ask this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So Carolyn, if you could just go back to that. So my name is Michael Quas. I'm a history teacher here at St. Ambrose. I think I'm going on my eighth year here now. I've lost track, I guess. So as I mentioned earlier, the topic of my talk is discerning truth in history. And in about 2 hours, there are going to be armies of fact checkers, not to check the facts of my talk, I hope, but to discern the truth of the candidates' claims during our very first presidential debate. It's getting underway at 8 o'clock. So for those of you who are planning on watching that, thank you for being here today, because you're going to have a good 3 hours plus of screen time. And for those of you who are not going to watch it, thank you for being here also. Our painting on the screen, on our title screen, was composed in 1890 by a Russian realist painter by the name of Nicholas Gay. And it's entitled, What is Truth, Christ and Pilate? And so just a quick review of John 18. So Pilate said to him, Then you are a king? Jesus answered, You say I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate said to him, What is truth? You know, I've always wondered how he asked that question. And what I like about this painting is how it captures much of that ambiguity in the way this question might be asked. For example, it could be asked in a very legalese way, right? Yes, but what is truth? Define your terms. Or Pilate could have been very earnest, right? Like, everyone who belongs to the truth, what is truth? Tell me. Or in a sort of mocking or postmodern or Nietzschean way, he might have said, what is truth, right? And it's probably that latter. So these are things to think about, I think, about the different ways we can ask this question about what do we mean by truth, and specifically, what do we mean by truth in history. So I'll start, as we sometimes do, with a quiz. So I have a little quiz for you, 2 sets of 4 questions. I'm going to ask you to decide the veracity of these questions. So it's a true-false quiz. I don't usually give these, but I thought this would be kind of fun. Okay. So the first one asks: Abraham Lincoln was the 15th president of the United States. B, Christopher Columbus discovered America. C, over 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And D, the Allied invasion of D-Day forced the German army to defend France, which reduced their ability to fight effectively against the Soviet Union. Okay? Set of questions. And then I have another set of questions for you. On balance, the New Deal was a success. And then B, the Crusades can be viewed as an example of early imperialism. C, General Robert E. Lee was a hero. And D, some African American slaves were treated kindly by their owners and probably weren't completely unhappy. So I'm not going to answer these questions, actually. If you'd like to know my opinions, or if you want to make a comment about that, please send that along, and maybe we can get to them at the end. But I wanted to illustrate two different sorts of sets of questions. You may have noticed that the first set were mainly factual questions and could have a pretty simple answer. Although the one about Columbus, there's some controversy surrounding that one. The second set of questions, though, are kind of, well, it depends type questions, right? It just depends. Now, is that to suggest that the truth of this is relevant? Because we have to ask, what does it depend on? Those are some of the questions, some of the approaches we take in history from grade 6 all the way to grade 12 at St. Ambrose. So this talk arose in part from one of my quarantine walks that I had with my wife, who asked me, who were the greatest presidents, or who was the greatest presidents? And I kind of asked, well, that depends. And then I thought, well, our students really want to have it, and many people want to know the answer to this question. Can we just say, it depends, because they really want to know? And so on one level you can say, well, you can take the political science approach. Well, the greatest presidents are those who get their agenda passed, right? Well, what if the president's party controls both houses of Congress? Is that really then a measure of greatness? It's probably not that hard to get an agenda passed when you control both houses of Congress. Also, what happens if it's an evil agenda, right? What if the president supports abortion laws? What if the president supported slavery, right? It is sort of a depends type question. It also arose from This talk also arose from a frankly grave concern that I have for our students, and really students anywhere, who are justifiably skeptical of the media, but are also becoming skeptical of history. And I would say developing an unhealthy skepticism that sees history in the same way that it sees the media, right? As something that might be inherently ideological. So they see views that don't agree with theirs, right, even at the high school level, and they reject a position, a historical position, carte blanche. So in a sense, it just reflects the general malaise that many of us have noticed in our polarized culture, where we're not always trying to understand one another, we're just trying to win or confirm what we already believe. And this, in some ways, shouldn't come as a surprise during the information age, because there should be a good amount of skepticism. But, my hope is that if we approach history honestly, critically, and with humility, we can offer a way to counteract those tendencies. And I'd like to propose how to do it. So I would say there's 3 principles for discerning truth in history. And the first is to recognize first that truth exists. So sometimes I wonder or I've wondered, I should say, I guess I still wonder this sometimes, if I'm a historian who happens to be Catholic, or am I a Catholic historian? And by the latter, I don't mean somebody who studies Catholicism, although I do a little bit of that, but someone who brings forth a set of truths to the practice of history. Right? And this is, by the way, is surely what Judge Amy Coney Barrett is going to be asked in the next several weeks, right? Are you going to be a Catholic Supreme Court justice, or are you just going to be a Supreme Court justice who happens to be Catholic? And I would argue that a Catholic historian and maybe a judge brings a particular worldview, a particular ontology to the study of history, a way of viewing the world and what exists. So in the Thomist tradition, we assume that a reality exists independent of our mind, and that what is true corresponds to that reality, however mediated it is by our senses or our mind. We also assume a fundamental anthropology to humankind, one that isn't dependent on the subject or society, and an anthropology that we are created in the image of God to know and to love and to serve him. So these are things that we bring to the table, and I think it's important to recognize that because we need some foundational truths from which to operate. The second principle is something I'll ask the students as early as 6th grade. How do we know what we think we know? In other words, check your sources, right? You read something. How do we know that that is true, right? How do we know that that's true, or we're just not believing it? And it's really a question of epistemology, or just straight empiricism. Thirdly, in terms of discerning truth in history, hopefully this begins and it ends in humility. We are all tourists in the past, immigrants, really. I mean, this is a world that we can only visit. We only get a snapshot. We only get a very incomplete view. And those of you who have traveled to different cultures notice the exoticism there. And most of us are very humbled, right? We're very humbled. We feel how in some ways, how weak we are there, how out of place we are there. And we have a sort of nascent respect for that place. That sort of thing happens in history. And as the prayer that we began with mentioned, we should seek to understand our brothers and sisters of the past, right? Before, I would say, we judge them. Before we judge them. Moreover, we must humbly recognize that if today we can't find the truth, it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? We have to be humble and recognize our own inhibitions. We also have to be humble and recognize that evidence may not exist, right? Sometimes there just isn't evidence to prove a claim. Or sometimes we recognize we're asking the wrong questions. We're asking the questions in an improper way, right? Which some of you may have recognized with maybe that second set of questions. And indeed, if we think about truth as true facts, right? If we think about the facts of history, well, that's fake news, or the facts are incorrect. We find that for the most part, that's sort of uncontroversial. Historians have been working with the same set of facts now for a really, really long time. There aren't a lot of undiscovered facts that are coming up anymore, at least written facts. And it's interpretation, I think, that creates the most interesting questions in history and the most controversial. So, for example, that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States is hardly controversial, right? Whether or not he was the greatest president makes for some stimulating discussion, especially if you're speaking with a sort of neo-Confederate or a Southerner, or even at the time, right, a Democrat. Now, this is not an affirmation necessarily, right, of moral relativism or this idea that there isn't truth in history, but it's rather a call for clarification of the way we ask questions and a recognition that sometimes we don't always know all of the answers. And sometimes when we analyze different perspectives about a historical event, we get different answers, and those perspectives tend to complicate our interpretations. They tend to complicate our interpretations. So what is history for anyway? And I ask the students at the beginning of every class every year, why do we study history? And they have an understanding of why it's important. They really do. Every time we talk about this, they come up with the following. They recognize that it tells us how we got here. It tells us who we are, right? And the beauty of history is that we can see the truth of our own time. They also recognize that it can provide empirical data, it can provide evidence for some of the fundamental questions of philosophy. Now, they don't always put them this way, right? But this is kind of what we come up with, right? Like, what is greatness? Who's a true hero, right? Who is truly great? Is there great nations? What is legitimacy? What is justice? How have people desired to know and love God in a historical context? What is progress, right? Where do we belong? Where is our place? Where is my place in relation to my parents? Where's my place in relation to the state, right? Where is my place in relation to God's natural world, right? And where's my relation and where am I with regard to heaven, right? These are all questions that history can help us answer. But we also learn when we ask this question about what history can do for us, that it's also a practice. You, especially at St. Ambrose, you actually do history, right? So even if you're just reading history, you're engaged in this process of discerning the truth. The truth, you're trying to figure out what really happened, right? What really happened, because you assume that something really happened. And you're thinking, why does it matter? So it provides us a means to approach truth. And then finally, our hope, right, our classical educator's utopian dream is that we study history for the same reason that we read poetry or great novels or listen to music, because it's beautiful, right? There's wonderment in it. There's admiration. There's heroism. It's an end in and of itself. And I think most everyone can agree with this. So what is the problem with truth in history, if everyone agrees with this, right? And I'm thinking maybe the questions we're asking are wrong, right? Because there can't be a problem with truth in history any more than there's a problem with beauty, right? Maybe the problem is with trust, right? We don't trust ourselves, and we don't trust the people who are providing information. So on September 17th, President Trump spoke at a White House conference on American history at the Rotunda of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I want to play a little clip of that, very short little clip.
The only path to national unity is through our shared identity as Americans. That is why it is so urgent that we finally restore patriotic education to our schools. Under our leadership, the National Endowment for the Humanities has awarded a grant to support the development of a pro-American curriculum that celebrates the truth about our nation's great history.
Okay, so one of the things I might ask my students to do, history students to do, is to provide a very simple summary of this. And this is something I think they'd come up with. And I think they would say the president is saying that our students, U.S. students, are not receiving the truth about history from their teachers, from their textbooks. And this is partly why we are so divided or polarized as a society. And an approach to history that emphasizes patriotism is going to heal those divisions. So recently, the American Historical Association, which is the preeminent professional association in the field, in the world, I would argue, echoed on the surface the same sentiments, right? It says the AHA deplores the use of history and history education at all grade levels and other contexts to divide the American people, rather than use our discipline to heal the divisions that are central to the heritage, right? So here you have the president and this group of professional historians who want to do the same thing, right? But you probably may have surmised that the American Historical Association is responding to the president and arguing that this sort of education is not what's going to heal those divisions. They say that healing those divisions requires an understanding of history and an appreciation for the persistent struggles of Americans. To hold the nation accountable for falling short of its lofty ideals. To learn from our history, we must confront it, understand it in all its messy complexity, and take responsibility as much for our failures as our accomplishments. Both sides agree that history might be, has the potential to divide us, right? What role does truth play in that, right? Is it a crisis of truth or is it a crisis of trust? And I argue it's a crisis in many ways of trust. So you've probably heard the phrase, we live in a post-truth society, the notions that there's been a disappearance of shared objectives for truth. It was like the word of the year, I think, in 2016, right? And this is not a new problem, right? So if we advance we've got the post-truth era there, and we advance the slide once more. The father of Western history, right? Herodotus argued most people, in fact, will not take the trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more, I think, inclined to accept the first story they hear, right? Sort of fake news, classical style. And I think that's, in many ways, that's what the president means, right? Who has really popularized this term of fake news, and that it's often that the facts are just simply wrong, but that they're incorrect, right? They're misrepresented, and as a result, they create these narratives that become untrue. Now, educated people recognize this, right? And we often think, well, it's not me, right? And we think it's easy. Oh, you just have to research, you have to weigh evidence, you have to use logic. Right? You have to use logic. But, the concern is that people are now starting to question some of the historically fact-finding entities, such as NASA, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Center for Disease Control. And let's not forget the mainstream media, too, right? Which is somewhat of an anachronism, right? Sort of a new term. But that used to be, right, and I would argue still is in many ways, one of the historically trusted fact-finding entities. I mean, this might be strange for somebody younger than me, right? But those of you my age and older probably remember a person by the name of Walter Cronkite, a journalist who was the most trusted man in America. And so one of the ways that we try to get at looking at truth in history is to look at truth in the media, right? In high school, especially at the high school level. And I think part of the concern is part of the critique of media we have, right? Students, part of the way we understand the way media can manipulate information, we can see that historians can do this as well. Media can set an agenda. They have a power to say, this is what I'm going to talk about, right? Historians in the textbook say, this is what we're going to emphasize. Media can decide this is the way that we are going to frame an issue. Historians can do the same thing. Media can decide this is the way we're going to prime our audience to respond to a certain issue. Historians can do the same thing, right? Although I would say they probably shouldn't. This happens all the time in history, and we have to approach it with a critical eye. So I'd like to talk about how we engage with this problem and teach history at St. Ambrose through the three cycles in classical education: the grammar, the logic, and the rhetoric stages. You'll notice in here, if you can read the fine print, there isn't a huge focus here on content, but rather on the skills. So learning how to think, learning how to become independent learners. So we're going to talk about truth across this trivium, which if you recall, right, or if you're not familiar with, is sort of the foundation, the three foundational parts of the classic liberal arts. And so we began with the grammar stage. So some of you might remember this book. Everything I learned in life, I learned in kindergarten, right? So you learn at the grammar stage the vocabulary of a particular discipline. So in history, we learn dates and facts, and we learn how to do things like construct timelines and learn the language of geography and things like that. But it's not always just the facts, right? We will ask them, how do we know what we know? So if we can advance a slide here, one of the oops, I wonder if that one's down just a little bit. I might be, yep, sorry about that. We'll introduce them to a little Kipling jingle, where one of the skills the students learn is how to write a historical definition. from the poet and author Rudyard Kipling. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. And then there's a little, Miles Davis, the jazz trumpeter, had a tune called So What, which is an easily hummable melody. So we hum that to say, so what is like, Columbus discovered America. Yeah, so what? Why is that important, right? The North won the Civil War. Yeah, so what? Why is that important? So that sort of thing. So we're always thinking not in terms of just this, but also why things are important. The 7th graders now are learning about European exploration and colonization to the Western Hemisphere. They just finished a lesson on Columbus, and we might ask them in true grammar stage methods, right? We might say, who was he, right? An Italian explorer. Later, when students might learn about the conquistadors, we might ask, was Columbus a conquistador, right? Maybe, right? We'll ask, why did he do what he did? Another journalist question. And they'll say, well, he wanted adventure. Okay, does the story end there? No. Well, he might have wanted riches as well. Does the story end there? No. He might have wanted to spread the gospel, right? He might have wanted, these are all things that he wanted to do. It's rare that there's just simple one motivation. And children in 6th grade, 7th grade, they can understand this, right? So we'll also ask, what do we know about Columbus? And they'll say, how do we know how do we know this information? How do we know it's true? And they'll say, well, it's in the book. And we'll say, how do we know that what's in the book is true? And they'll say, well, they got it from a different book. How do we know that that's true? They got it from a different book. And eventually the students will learn, right, that they're getting these from the original sources. They'll learn that Columbus kept journals, right? And he wrote letters. And people learn about him from these journals and the letters. So until we build a time machine, that's all we have to go by. And being able to do this goes a long way, even at the junior high level, to learning how to skillfully ask questions about history, right, which are so important later on into life. Students will also write a timeline. The chronology that students learn in a timeline is very important because then they start to think in terms of causal relationships. They see that things are laid out there and that there's a relationship among events. And of course, in history, it's very much about cause and effect, especially since the Enlightenment. They also learn how messy recreating historical events can be. One of my favorite activities to do with the youngsters is to take primary sources of the court records of the British regulars who were tried for murder during the Boston Massacre in the years preceding the American Revolution and try and recreate that scenario outside, right? Get an idea of the dimensions, where were they standing, where were the shots fired, right? What were the British doing, et cetera. So the second element of the trivium, which extends, I would say, roughly speaking, to 8th grade and to the 9th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, is what we call the logic stage. And at this phase, we ask several of the core questions to help us think about history in terms of events, in terms of processes, in terms of artifacts. And we're looking at what we call the 3 C's, right? What is the cause? What is the effect? What changed? What remained the same? And then what's the context, right? How did people view their world at this time? Why would people think that slavery was somehow an acceptable institution? Why would people think that women in the United States should not vote, right? This sort of thing. Second thing is culture. When we study history, what do these sources tell us about the habits and the beliefs and the customs and the practices of the people who lived there at the time? And then finally, comparisons, right? Students are sometimes interested to know that when they're studying feudalism, that about that same time they had feudalism in Japan too, right? In many ways very, very similar, but in many ways very different. Is it a coincidence, or is there some explanation for that? So one of the things that happens, very important, I think, in the logic phase at St. Ambrose is that in Religion 1, actually not in history, they In the Religion 1 class, they learn, somewhat to their surprise, they get an introduction to formal logic. And sometimes they're surprised, they learn that the purpose of formal logic isn't to discover truth, right? But to teach us to derive one truth from another. Right? To put it another way, in the words of C.K. Chesterton, you can only find truth with logic if you've already found truth without it, right? So this is important. And so when I mentioned earlier, right, we have to know that truth exists, and we have to think about some foundational truths, right, in order to create these chains, right? These chains of truths, especially when we start to make more detailed causal arguments in history. So it's this process of connecting facts or statements of facts, really, that we try to cultivate in history in the logic phase. So, for example, we might introduce a concept of, say, divine pedagogy, by which God has slowly taught humanity more and more about himself in stages. And we might then ask the students to explain how, say, Pope Gregory the Great, how his letters of admission to missionaries in England, actually, reflect the application of this theological principle with regard to the conversion of pagans. And so they're comparing students will also compare sources and try to arrive at the truth in the logic stage, right? They'll look at European and Islamist accounts of the Crusades. Here they'll be introduced to perspectives. They're describing the same event, and then they're going to see a very different emphasis in each event. Or they might look at a comparison between the Spanish and Nahuan accounts of the conquest of Tenochtitlan in the early 16th century in Mexico. And students will read both of these accounts, and they're humbled by it, really. I mean, despite some glaring inaccuracies on each side, neither group views these accounts as fake news, right? And recognize that both of them are necessary for a complete picture of history. So when the students finally reach their junior and senior year here, right, they're fully in the rhetoric stage. And in history, the students are asked to make a truth claim of their own by advancing a thesis for a research paper. And to do this, to prepare them for this, they also critique some of the most famous or perhaps infamous theses in modernity. Oh, so we want to go back one more. I don't know if I put that up. Actually, I probably didn't. Okay, so I'll just read them to you. Some of you might recognize the references here. Man was born free, but everywhere is in chains. I think, therefore I am. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. So three theses, right, from modernity. They will also research citations from scholarly sources. So we have a whole list here from a journal article. So when we ask the students, we insist that the students for their research paper use at least one scholarly source, preferably a book, and that in order to work with primary sources, we encourage them to do what all historians do, and that is to mine the sources, right? In other words, to go as a good journalist should to these sources and to look at the sources and then to go back and find them, right? So here, this is just a series of footnotes of sources that a student might encounter, and they'll say, okay, I'm going to go and look at this original primary source, and I'm going to, or a secondary source, and I'm going to try and see if this actually says what the writer says it says. This, by the way, is actually are footnotes from one of our students' research papers. So pretty impressive paper. Now, in order to craft a thesis, right, the students, a thesis when we think of a thesis as an argument to be proven by a proposition that is to be proven by an argument, there has to be a sort of counter-argument for it. So it's not just enough to argue for your position. You also have to establish, you have to think about what are the counter-arguments, right? Someone might say, well, the Civil War was fought over slavery. Someone might say, no, it was fought over states' rights. How do you defend that position? And this is particularly important because many of our students are passionate about social justice issues. And the problem that I see sometimes, the problem that I have too, is we tend to focus on our own side, right? All the justifications for our position, without thinking about what a political opponent or what or even an interlocutor might say, as opposed to our argument. So we encourage students to think about, well, what if you advance a thesis about something, you need to think about what the arguments against your position are, right? So if you want to be someone who is fighting for social justice, you have to know the opponent's side. There's also one of the things that I think has really been fantastic about the paper at the rhetoric stage is just seeing sometimes the thrill of doing research, especially those students who are able to develop an original thesis. They come up with a hypothesis, they frame these questions, they start looking for it, and then when they get into the primary sources, they start to find answers. And there's a real sort of thrill. There's a real sort of intellectual satisfaction I can see, because I recognize that they're weighing, right? They're thinking about these things, and they're weighing their arguments, and they're using all of these tools they have learned going all the way till back till 6th grade, and now they're writing history. And that's very satisfying for them. It's very satisfying for me. So think back about your favorite teachers. I mean, what do you remember? Favorite history teachers. What do you remember about them, right? You probably don't remember the facts. And if you do remember the facts, they're probably larger, they're probably just supporting evidence for a larger lesson you learned from them. I think what you really remember, or what I remember about my favorite history teachers, is they made history very human, right? They made it come alive. There was this thrill of discovery, of discovering the truth, right? Of being part of that journey. And in this sense, history shapes the person, right? History shapes the person. And the shaping isn't done by facts, but by the discovery of truth, right? By the discovery of truth. So it isn't necessarily an arrival, right? We never arrive there, but a process. So in the end, Pilate didn't ask the wrong question, right? He asked it in the wrong way. Had he asked it with humility, right, he might have actually learned something about the truth. So, thank you for joining me for this first evening in this year's Spotlight Lecture Series. Remember to visit ambroseacademy.org/spotlight for the full lineup, and you can join us back here on Tuesday, November 10th for Mrs. Emily Swanson's lecture, Contemplation of God in Nature. Have a good night. God bless you. I'm looking forward to some questions. Yeah, so one of the questions people asked is, how do you engage shy kids to converse? A couple of different ways. One thing is, it doesn't take long for us to know that they're shy, and we're a small school, and we're also a school that prides ourselves on getting to know the students. So I like to know a little bit about them, and then to use their interests as a way of getting them into a conversation, right? And so we try and connect something that they might be interested in into history, for example. So the next question is, many modern scriptural scholars now claim that many of the things stated in the Gospels about Jesus are not true, but were later added in order to portray Jesus as divine. In other words, they claim that the narrator or historian is not reliable. Setting aside faith for a moment, is there a way of getting at the truth of what happened in the ancient Near East 2,000 years ago? The short answer, I would say, is no, right? I think there's a paucity of sources. And so again, setting aside faith, of course, is an important issue here, because you could also think about any number of sources that claim to be that have changed or have been amended over time. But of course, the key to the Gospels is that these are not just symbolic representations, right? These are things that have actually happened. So I would think that I would use the same method I would use about, say, something that I'm interested in my field of research, which would be like Wisconsin political history in the 19th century, is I would try and go and look at the sources, and also to look at these arguments, right? To look at these arguments and say, okay, what is the rationale for this, right? And frankly, to watch some YouTube debates on it, if there are things like that, and to inform myself that way. The next question, another question is, who do you think was, or which do you think was the greatest president? I can't answer that. I can only tell you who's the greatest rock guitarist. No, I'm just kidding. I can answer that. I love these greatest questions. It was. For me, it was Abraham Lincoln, for all of the reasons. Now, granted, he had a very sympathetic Congress, but not as much as you might think, right? He was under incredible pressures, and he did things that I felt he didn't have to do, right? There were all these voices, right? There are all these voices coming to him about freeing the slaves, and there's all these voices saying, no, don't do it. And I think he really he acted out of conscience, and I think he showed great virtues. So for all of those reasons. What's a good source for good books to read about history, maybe organized by topic? Wow, I think about that. I think about that a lot, and some of them, there's different approaches. I mean, some look at those that are peer-reviewed, right? So you look at things that have won, say, like the National Book Award, Pulitzer Prize-winning books, or the Booker Prize, things like that. It's always a good idea to ask people sometimes too, like people whose opinions you trust. I know I was just on the internet the other day, and I came across Bishop Robert Barron's favorite movies, and I thought, oh, this could be kind of interesting, right? I mean, he's I respect him, and he's very reasonable, I think, and that's an approach too. But there are hosts of bibliographies. What I love is if you can find a good book on a larger subject that has what's called an annotated bibliography. I think those are great. But sometimes those are like reading. Those of you who've gone through the doctoral process, right, PhD process, know that's like reading your books for your prelims. So. As students come from different backgrounds and levels of history and knowledge, how do you integrate them into the St. Ambrose model? Yeah, that's a great question too, right? Because there's no question that your cultural background shapes who you are, right? So when I know that in years past and now too, right? We've had students here in a church history class who are not Catholics, and a class like that presupposes just a lot of Catholic knowledge that many of our Catholic students take for granted. I think the assumption, my assumption here, goes to that first principle I talked about earlier, and that is that we have an anthropology, right? We have an anthropology that fundamentally, right, we're coming from cultural backgrounds, but we're not that different. and that is that lessons that you can teach about truths in history can be about any period in time, right? It can be any period in time, and in many instances, and any culture as well. And the levels of history and passion and knowledge, that's a classic question. Very often we have to differentiate our instruction in those instances to meet the students where they're at, but also while fulfilling, right, the educational requirements and objectives we have in our curriculum. Yeah. So I don't know if we disappeared or not. So can they hear me still or no? Okay. Is it back? What?
They can hear us.
Oh, they can hear us. Good. Oh, okay. So again, thank you all for listening tonight. I know the debate's going to begin in about 15 minutes or so. Hopefully, you can bring a critical approach to that. Reminder again that Mrs. Emily Swanson is going to be here on Tuesday, November 10th, talking about contemplation of God in nature. And I should add that Mrs. Emily Swanson is our biology teacher. And boy, I have really learned a lot from her with regard to ecology as well, as was an interest of mine. And then I think in January, maybe, Carolyn, is Dr. Ludwig giving a talk about, in December he is? Yeah, Dr. Ludwig is giving a talk about the Vikings, followed by the Bears and the Packers. Sorry, bad dad joke. No, the Scandinavian Vikings. And Dr. Ludwig is an archaeologist, a biblical archaeologist, and I've experienced his lectures on this for the 9th and 10th graders, and it's fabulous. So you're going to really learn a lot from that. So I'm very, very stoked about the upcoming talks. So thank you again for joining us. God bless you, and hope to see you in person soon.